This Choircast podcast is brought to you by The Choirlings, a private Facebook page for people going through deconstruction, where each month we go through a book together, not only discussing it with each other, but also with the actual author of the book. It's a great way to connect with other people going through deconstruction and also connect with the author of books that are going to encourage you along your journey. If you'd like to join us, find us on Facebook. It's Choirlings, Quoirlings. Hope to see you there.
The majority of our life is lived in liminal space.
And there's this in-between space, this liminal space.
This liminality that reveals possibility.
I think we're in a liminal moment, but also in a place of transformation. We could actually change as a people.
I have great affection for the church and a troubled relationship with it.
That can't be the gospel, because God said to love our neighbors.
Just to be alive in time means that we're on the threshold of the future.
Just to begin questioning is so difficult, because you have these voices in your ears telling you that you're not a real Christian.
We don't know what the future looks like. We have to work it out together.
Welcome to the Liminal Living podcast, where we have conversations with those who are going through dark nights or deconstruction. Well, Dillon, Naber, Cruz, welcome to the Liminal Living podcast. It's great to have you here in Michigan from all the way in Pennsylvania, I believe you're in, right?
Yeah, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, Amish country, there's a lot of Amish folk around there, right?
Oh yeah, sometimes we get horse and buggies going right downtown, and the farmers market there has a lot of Amish and Mennonite people selling produce and meat and pastries and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, we get the Anabaptist community is well represented here in Lancaster County.
Yeah, there's a small, I live in Michigan in a rural section in central Michigan, and there is a small Mennonite community here as well. There's a strong presence, and we got horse and buggies going down the road on some major highways, and they got their flashers going, and it's really interesting. That's quite a different culture for sure. Oh yeah,
and it brings a lot of people in who are curious about the Amish, and
the Amish,
or they conflate all the Anabaptists together, and they don't realize that there are progressive Mennonites that you would never know were Mennonite, and then there are horse and buggy Mennonites, and they're not Amish, but they are Anabaptist, and then all of the Amish are horse and buggy folks. So. It's a really rich cultural heritage here, and it's an incredible juxtaposition between. We also have a lot of Christian nationalism here, so you've got the Mennonites and the Amish who do not try to force their beliefs on everybody, and then you've got the hardcore Christian nationalists in the same county kind of competing for theological airspace, so to speak, and they are trying to force their views and beliefs on everybody. So it's an interesting place theologically to explore.
Yeah, and you're probably stuck right in the middle of all that weird cultureness going on around you. Well,
oh yeah.
What are you up to? What are you up to in Lancaster County? What are you up to? What do you do?
Well, I continue to write. My current writing project is entitled, if I ever start working on it again, A Carpenter, a Tent Maker, and the Case Against Christian Nationalism. And that's about the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Paul, and how they do not align with the teachings of the Christian nationalists, be they New Apostolic Reformation types or Reformed types like Doug Wilson. And I blog. I do some media stuff on SiriusXM with a comedian named John Fugelsang every Wednesday night. And then we have the God Squad pod that we do on Thursday nights. So I stay busy with my brand of, I'll just say, heterodox theology, and trying to share what I feel like is good news of love of neighbor and the upliftment of the marginalized, be they, economically marginalized or, black, brown, immigrants, LGBTQ plus communities, disabled communities, etc. Trying to lift up those voices and push back against patriarchy and theocratic nationalism and that sort of thing.
Well, you got your job cut out for you, for sure.
Yes. Yes, I do. I do.
Well, you're talking about some different biblical figures here. Like, here's a cool question. If you could have dinner with 3 biblical figures, who would they be, and what would you ask of them? Now, this can be intentional, like you're going to create a fist fight at the table, or it could be more of, like, you want to sit down and learn something directly from the source of something. Who would they be, and what would you expect to hear out of them?
Oh, wow.
What do you think?
That's a brilliant question. I mean, I would have to choose Jesus, and probably Paul, and for the third, maybe John of Patmos.
Oh,
and I would,
nice one.
I would ask Jesus, why were some of the things that you said so esoteric? Why are so many of your teachings hard to comprehend for humanity when some of them are pretty wide open? They might be open to interpretation, but they're pretty simple to understand, maybe hard to execute. My first book was about the golden rule and permaculture, and kind of looking at Jesus's teaching on the golden rule and applying that to today. And why this intense focus on celibacy that Jesus and Paul both seem to have. And for Paul, like, why were you sometimes so contrary to the actual teachings of Christ at times? Because Paul's kind of a hard dude to wrap your head around.
Mm-hmm.
And I do not subscribe to the everything that's attributed to Paul is written by Paul, kind of conservative school of thought. So I'd be more interested in talking about the undisputed letters that he wrote. And did he have the idea that, and I don't think he did, but, that what he was writing was going to be seen by some people as for all times and all places? Or how contextual did he see it? And for John of Patmos, I might say, dude, where did you get whatever you were using when you wrote that? Because that sounds interesting.
What mushrooms did you ingest?
Exactly. If it was it a fungus? Was it a lichen? What was happening there? And also, wow. Did you anticipate that your book that barely made it into the canon was going to 2,000 years later cause so many problems with people trying to figure out the top secret end times code and stuff like that? Or was this just literally like, hey, Christians, if you're in a violent empire, here's how to very creatively, I'm going to express how to not participate. Mm-hmm. Because there's so much of what Paul and Jesus and the book of Revelation say that is really strange for modern or postmodern ears. Mm-hmm. And we know things now, obviously, scientifically, about the human mind and the body that they didn't know. So how do we navigate their teachings for a wildly different cultural and social construct that we have now? That's a fantastic question.
Those are good musings as well. Like, because those are questions that I've had. I don't like to teach on Paul's writings very much because I find that I have to unteach like 75% of the teaching needs to be unteaching before I can actually get into the content, and it just takes so long and it's so much work. I guess for better or for worse, like I'm just sticking with Gospels and Jesus right now and just trying to figure that out. But here's my 3, and this is reflecting after hearing you talk. I would get Luke, I would get John of Patmos, and I would get Jesus in the room, and then I would have Luke and John like fight it out because they were contrary to one another. Because Luke has like Luke and in the book of Acts, they're like one work, Luke Acts, and it was all about getting to Rome and getting Rome on your side so that Christianity will be safe. Like that's Paul's entire point was I got to make it to Rome. And then he gets to Rome and it's happily ever after. And then we read some other books and we're like, I guess it wasn't happily ever after. He was beheaded. But, so we have this like globalism is cool. We got to work with it because it's happening. So let's try and get into the places that it's at. But then you got John and he's like, nope, that's the beast. That's, any attempts of the church to partner with globalistic, empire is going to be the whore of Babylon. And it's like, he just like, I would like to see those two fight it out with those two ideas because, you look at the two arcs of that and then Jesus is just there to referee. So he's going to be like, hey, keep it nonviolent, guys. Like that's his
right.
job.
Yeah. Yeah. Fight, but don't fight.
Right. Yeah. So that would be my three. I'd like to see them duke it out because I was reading John Dominic Crossan, and he was just kind of he's the one who highlighted that for me. Like Luke is totally cool with going to Rome and getting them on your side, and then you have John. And he's like, nope, that's evil. That's the devil. It's going to ruin everything. And it's like these two things. It's like wow, and they're right in our Bible. Like how do we do this? And we wonder why this is such a hard book to read. And it's like, as you said, they're like fighting with each other and contradicting each other. It's just, it's odd. But there you go. That's my three. What do you think?
Well, I think that's fantastic. And it's one of the reasons why I say very often that orthopraxy is more important than orthodoxy. Because we can hone in on certain aspects of the various disparate text and highlight something that we think is important, and that if you're Joel Webon, it's going to be some of the forgeries, as Ehrman would call them, or Deuteropauline that other scholars call them, about misogyny and women being quiet and all that kind of stuff. Or you can focus on the things that Jesus talks about, which again, love is central to everything Jesus taught. And maybe that looks different in the ancient Near East than it does now. But if we err on the side of love and grace, I don't think Jesus, if there is a period of questioning when I give up this mortal coil, I don't think he's going to say, yo, dude, you were a little bit too loving to the marginalized. You extended grace a little bit too readily to those who might have harmed you. I don't, and also you didn't get the belief exactly right. And I'd be like, my dude, you could have made it a little more clear then, because
just being honest,
just you made it kind of hard for us here in the 21st century at times. So yeah, I think that's really important. The way we live out the teachings of love of neighbor, of grace. My canon within a canon has long been the golden rule and the love of neighbor. And you find that not just in Matthew 7:12, but it's, the golden rule is also expressed in the Sermon on the Plain. And Paul says multiple times throughout his letters that, love of neighbor is literally the thing. And then he expounds on it, expatiates on other things, but that's the core of it. So that's for me is why orthopraxy is always going to be more important than orthodoxy, which is the radically opposite of what a lot of theologians say and think and do.
I sat down with I was an Eastern Orthodox, I don't know what they're called, father, priest, somebody.
I think priest, or
priest?
father, yeah.
I'm not very familiar with that tradition, but he was trying to explain to me what orthodoxy meant. And he kind of pointed out that we have orthodoxy as ideas, correct doctrines that you're supposed to jam inside of your skull. And he said, but if you look at the actual Greek words, you have ortho, which means to make straight, like an orthodontist or something. And then you have doxa, which means worship. And so he was explaining to me, like, all of these creeds and stances on doctrines were not so that we created lines of who's in and who's out, but so that we knew how to properly aim our worship. And I was like, oh man, I've never thought about it that way.
That's a radically different way of seeing it than the Western theological tradition. And yeah, wow.
Yeah, and then they kind of temper it with orthopraxis, proper practice of the faith, and then orthopathy, which is a properly ordered loves, where you're supposed to, have love of neighbor and self, and like the properly ordered loves. And I was just like, man, where were you when I was like 16 and hearing all this doom and gloom, and it's like, it's like, you better have all these ideas correct or you're burning, man.
Yeah, well, I got told that for the very first time at 9 years old, which is
not traumatizing
it's
at all.
No, not even a little bit. I mean, it is just a profoundly messed up thing to do to a 9-year-old child.
Seriously. Well, that brings me to my next question. Like, what kind of soil did your life grow up out of, and how did faith play a part?
Well, in my immediate household, my mother, for much of my childhood and early childhood, was a single mom, and we didn't go to church as such. But then we would go to our grandparents, and they would send us to Sunday school at Hillcrest Church of the Nazarene, or I would go with my other grandparents to the Church of Christ. And for those who don't know, the Church of Christ believes that they go straight back to Paul and Jesus and all that stuff, and they're literally the only ones going to be in heaven because, they have one cup and one loaf, and they don't have Sunday school, and they don't have instrumental music and all that kind of stuff. So it's very hyper-conservative, very fundamentalist. Mm-hmm. And then at 9, my not overly religious grandparents were buying cemetery plots. And the guy who was selling the plots just happened to be a fundamentalist.
Oh, fun.
So they called us into the living room, and he did the Roman Road of Salvation while selling cemetery plots. It's a great gig. I mean, such a sales pitch, right?
Wow. I knew they were salesy, but that's over the top.
Yeah. And told me at 9 years old that if I didn't say what I now call the magic bean prayer, because if you put the beans in, it gives you a beanstalk right up to heaven.
Oh, that's a good one.
That I was going to die and fry forever. I was 9.
Yeah, that's messed up.
And then we moved to Texas when I was just shy of my 12th birthday, and the first people that knocked on the door to welcome us to Blue Ridge, Texas, MapDOT, in North Texas, was the secretary of the First Baptist Church, a Southern Baptist church, and her daughter, giving us a Bible and inviting us to church. So I got saved in that church, whatever that means, and started to be indoctrinated into Southern Baptist theology, which I now know is slaveholder Christianity. Mm-hmm. And then my grandparents, when I would go visit them, who were Church of Christ, they said that the baptism in the Baptist church wasn't correct, and I was still going to go to hell if I didn't get baptized, because the Baptist church baptizes for membership into the church, and the Church of Christ baptizes for the remission of sins, and that's the one right way. So I got baptized twice, and then the Satanic Panic happened in the 1980s. And that was a very big thing in Southern Baptist circles and small towns in North Texas like the one I grew up in. So I ended up with rapture anxiety and all that kind of stuff until I was about 30. And I married when I was in the Marine Corps. I was 19 years old, and I met a graduate of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary who had a master's in religious education, and in that world, you're supposed to get married young and start having babies for Jesus, kind of thing. So I got married at 19, really unwise, with the benefit of hindsight. So I was steeped in conservative white fundamentalism, and it scrambled my eggs. mentally, spiritually, emotionally. And I could not live up to this image that they kind of say you're supposed to be. I was too much of the earth. I was too much... I liked sex, and not just for making babies. I loved baseball. I still love baseball. And one time I had a conversation with my pastor, and he went to my then wife and was like, I'm really concerned because Dillon is concerned that there might not be baseball in heaven. And, and I was like, but I love baseball, so why wouldn't there be baseball in heaven, right? Like, if heaven's this place where we all get to go and things are hunky-dory and lovely, then, yeah, then baseball should be a part of that, right? And I wasn't focused enough on what the right belief was and sin management enough and stuff like that. And then I started my undergraduate studies later. I was a non-traditional student, and my course of academic study was history. And just stepping away even for little bits of the day to go to class and learn new things outside of the evangelical fundamentalist bubble. Not even necessarily learning about, well, I wasn't learning about theology. I was, studying history as an academic discipline. And that started to unravel the giant ball of fundamentalist yarn that had been ensnaring and entangling me. And at one point in about 2003, I was starting to question a lot because by then I was getting into my upper level undergraduate classes. I was starting to question a lot, and my wife at the time was like, everybody goes through this when they go to college. You're going to come out on the other side. Your faith is going to be stronger. And that's not what happened. I ended up walking away from the church. She was a chaplain at that time in the Army. After I got out of the Marine Corps, she joined the Army and became a chaplain. And it was in 2003. It was about this time of the year. If I'm remembering correctly, it was before the second invasion of Iraq. And I was in a Sunday school room, and I had been convicted for weeks that I had not stood up in the military chapel to say, how about instead of praying for a quick war or a victory in war, how about we pray for no war? And I didn't use my prophetic voice because, wow, that would have been really pushing back against the structure of that level of Christianity. And my wife was the chaplain in that church. So she was the de facto pastor of that chapel. And this guy came in and he said, Bush has had enough. We're going to war, baby! In the church. And I just put whatever I was working on down and I just walked out. And she said, what was that? And I gave her my opinion, and she did not like it. I said, the man nearly ejaculated because we're going to go kill brown people. And she said, how could you possibly say that? I'm like, what? She goes, you said ejaculated. And I'm like, that's the problem here? No, the problem is that we're not living out Matthew 5:9, not even a little bit. And I left. And then I wandered spiritually in the desert for about a dozen years. And during that time, I read a bunch of books on Buddhism. I took a class on the Reclaiming tradition, which is an eco-feminist spirituality that infuses permaculture that was started by a woman named Starhawk. And I started reading some of Bart Ehrman's popular works. And when I read those, I was super pissed. I was like, wow, nobody ever told me these things. And so I didn't know what to do with the embedded theology that was still there and lurking. And I didn't know what to do with myself as this very spiritual being who wants to understand higher truth and also the interconnectedness and things like that. And then in 2015, I was in my 40s, and I was going through what a lot of people do in their 40s, kind of an existential crisis. Some things hadn't worked out the way I wanted them to, professionally, etc. And I talked to my best friend from high school, and he's like, I have the gift of discernment. What's going on, man? And I was like, well, I'm kind of floundering. I don't know what's going on. And he said, I'll pray about it. I said, okay, man. But I wasn't a churchgoer anymore. I didn't call myself a Christian anymore. And like a week later, he got back to me and he's like, so I prayed about it. Here's what God said. You're supposed to tell Christian America about permaculture. And I was like, Jeff, I'm not a Christian anymore. And he literally just said, that's between you and God, man. That's what I got. Now, Jeff doesn't know the first thing about permaculture. So, I took this seriously. And then literally, out of nowhere, I was going to seminary. And when I was in seminary, I was on the MDiv track. And after the first year, I realized that wasn't for me. I have PTSD, and me doing, chaplaincy kind of education in a trauma ward was not going to be good for me. So, and that was part of it. You had to do it. And I was like, no, that's not going to be good for my mental or physical health and well-being. So I switched tracks to the academic track to get a master's in religion. And I ended up writing my thesis, which they expected to be 30 or 40 pages, on the golden rule in permaculture, and it turned into my first book. And my theology professor, Dr. Lee Barrett, was like, this is outstanding. This is original. You need to get this published. And I didn't know the first thing about any of that. He gave me the name of one publisher, and I said, okay, and I submitted it to them, and they said yes. And I didn't realize that that's not normally how that works. Normally you submit it to a bunch of places until you get a yes. It was during the course of writing that I discovered that I couldn't separate what I had learned starting in 2007 about permaculture, which is a ecological design science, and theology. And in permaculture, you look for patterns. So patterns in nature is how a permaculturist would end up designing a site that would turn into a cultivated ecosystem. And I started looking for patterns in spirituality. And one that jumps out is that the golden rule is in all of the major faiths and ethical traditions. And so I figured that must be something that whatever God is thinks is important. And I looked at it through the Christian lens because that's culturally how I grew up. And once that happened, I started going to church again. I went to a United Church of Christ congregation. I had some really profound numinous experiences in worship. And then that church kind of COVID, as it did with a lot of churches, radically altered it. And then I wandered in the desert for a little while again, and now I'm going to a church that used to be associated with the United Methodist Church, but split over the LGBTQ plus issue. And I'm kind of, to borrow your phrase, in a liminal space, because I'm not an Orthodox Christian, but I think the Bible's really interesting, and because it speaks to about 2 billion people, at least ostensibly, globally, it's one of the more important collections of texts that have ever been written. And I want to understand it enough to help Christians understand what I believe is the crux of the issue. And that is not having a certain prescribed set of beliefs necessarily, and that not everything in the anthology is true and correct. I often say the first book of the Bible says that the earth is a flat disk with a dome-shaped lid. So right away, we're off the rails on inerrancy, literally in chapter 1. So, okay. Start there. And what do you see as the arc in the collection of text? Mm-hmm. And there's always this movement towards more love and more inclusivity, more grace. Mm-hmm. And whether or not, and because I grew up in a modernist world with a very modernist fundamentalist construct, it can be very difficult to think about, okay, so the resurrection. The historian in me is like, yeah, no, we can't posit that as a historical fact. That's not how historians work. The theologian in me and the person who experiences things sometimes while in worship is like, well, I don't know, because I started bawling one time on an Easter Sunday service when I was having another of my many crises of faith when my New Testament professor, who happened to be reading the scripture that day, said the women got to the tomb and found it empty, and I just lost it right there in the pew. Just absolutely lost it. Started bawling. Like, that is such a beautiful moment, and I don't know what the heck it means, right? So there's something there for me. There's still juice in the fruit. And I'm still trying to navigate what it looks like to be a post-fundamentalist theologian who finds a lot of interest in the teachings of Jesus, some of the teachings of Paul, and the Bible in general, without subscribing to necessarily everything that quote-unquote Western Orthodoxy says is true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what a journey. Like, you have, like, it almost feels roller coaster like, where it's,
oh yeah,
you've got moments where you're standing up for what you believe in right in the middle of like a Marine chaplain service, and like wow, and yet you still like are struggling with the historicity of things with the academic part of your brain, and and yet you're still like moved in a spiritual sense. I think that is just the mark of authenticity, where our brains are like, I can't like mentally put my brain around the concept of this because I'm used to thinking in the historical section. But then there's something here because it moves me, it changes me. There's a transforming effect here, and then to try and define that, that's really difficult to kind of live in that liminal space between, the brain's experience and explanations, and then that spiritual movements of things. And a lot of people are there, like they're in that liminal space of, I understand that the way that I held my faith was not, the ultimate metaphysic for all of reality. Like that's
right.
Like I think when you're fundamentalist, you think your theology is metaphysic at the same, like this is full description of reality. You peel back, reality, you're going to see like, a Trinitarian throne, an old man and a white beard and Middle Eastern man and like whatever the spirit is going to look like, and there's angels and demons fighting each other, and you're just so convinced that your theology describes the ultimate metaphysical reality. And then like you get exposed to thoughts outside of the bubble, which is why they don't want you to get exposed to thoughts outside of the bubble. And then you realize, wow, this bubble is way too small to encapsulate all reality, but it sure is handy to control and manipulate a group of people to, hunker down together in opposition to everything outside of the bubble. That's kind of how I've experienced fundamentalism myself, growing up in a more of a charismatic fundamentalist branch.
Yeah.
We're taking a quick break here mid-show to let you know of an opportunity that Choir is offering. Are you deconstructing your faith? It's tough, believe me, I know, I've done it. But what if you didn't have to do it alone? Imagine having guides like Jim Palmer, Kristen Dumais, Jennifer Knapp, Brad Jerzak, Brian Zahn, Paul Young, and more by your side to help. I know I would have loved that on my journey. Well, now you can. Head on over to choiracademy.com, link will be in the show notes, and register for their Square 2 class using the promo code LIMINAL, and you will get 10% off. This course and community are designed to help you navigate your journey with wisdom and support, all because you're a fan of the Liminal Living podcast. Ministry leaders, how do you heal from the burnout, loneliness, and the relentless weight of leadership? Kaneo Center exists for you. For 5 years, Kaneo has walked with over 500 ministry leaders through their darkest seasons, offering a rare blend of compassionate coaching, therapeutically informed practices, and Jesus-centered renewal. Kaneo is launching new 24-week cohorts now, where you'll join a small group of leaders for weekly video coaching, guided curriculum, and reflections to rebuild your resilience. The cohort all ends with a retreat in Puerto Rico. As a Kaneo coach myself, I've seen how this space transforms lives. And for Liminal Living listeners, mention Liminal in your application at thecaneocenter.com/cohort to claim $100 off your cohort experience. You've poured into others, let Kaneo pour into you. If you're in a dark night or deconstruction, you know how vital it is to ground yourself in intentional practice. That's why I'm thrilled to partner with the Monk Manual, a journaling system inspired by monastic wisdom and backed by science. The Monk Manual is a daily journal companion for reflection, purpose, and aligning your actions with your deepest values. Whether you're rebuilding after deconstruction or seeking clarity in transition, this tool turns liminality into grounded growth. And now, Liminal Living listeners can save 10% on their Monk Manual using the code LIMINAL over at monkmanual.com/liminal. And remember, the wisdom of liminal spaces lies in how we journey through them. So do it with intention. And now back to our show.
I've had experiences that I cannot explain. And some of those were because my mother, when she remarried, they started going to a Pentecostal kind of church. And before that, I broke my arm playing basketball in high school, and I had worked my tail off to become a starting varsity basketball player, and then in the 6th game of the season, I fractured just above my elbow and dislocated my arm during a game. And the doctor said, "You're done for the season." And I, again, being a very emotional guy, and I was hopped up on God only knows how much Demerol and Valium so that they could put it back in the socket. And so I was devastated by that, and I went to my a good friend's house church, and they were charismatic, and I said, and it was a Sunday night, and I said, lay hands on me, I want to be healed, right? And then they did, and then I went to the doctor the subsequent Tuesday and said, take an x-ray. The doctor's like, I'm not taking an x-ray, you're not playing basketball. And I just kept harping on it until my mom said, please just take an x-ray or he won't shut up. And the doctor came in shaking his head and he goes, I don't understand this. The fracture's gone. And I was like, so I can play basketball now? And he said, I have no reason to tell you no. Wow. And then he walked out shaking his head. Now, I don't know what the hell happened there, but 17-year-old Dillon firmly believed that because of what I understood about the Bible at that time, and that a bunch of people laid their hands on me and prayed, that fracture disappeared. Mm-hmm. I took communion for the first time in early 2016, and I went up, I got the bread, I dipped it in the wine, and then I walked back to my seat, and it's literally the second my butt hit the pew, I just started weeping. Just sobbing. And it was like this experience of grace that I couldn't wrap my head around. But it was like so much of the fundamentalist nonsense was somehow washed away in that moment. Mm-hmm. So, but I've also had experiences where I was outside of Christian context and experienced something spiritual and revelatory that didn't have anything to do with Christianity. So I have a hard time these days saying anything with certitude about God. I can say with certainty that Jesus said that the entire law and the prophets is the golden rule. because it's right there in black and white. You can just read it in Matthew chapter 7. It's right there. Or you can read Luke 10:25 through 37, where it says, love of neighbor is the second greatest commandment, or it is the greatest commandment. Love God, love your neighbor. It's right there in the text. All right, I can say that with certainty. I can't say with certainty that a peasant carpenter or artisan from Nazareth or Bethlehem or somewhere in the in the ancient Near East is the one and only Son of God, just because that's what it seems to say in the Gospels. But I can't chuck God altogether. And apparently I can't chuck Christianity altogether because I keep finding myself after periods of spiritual wandering in church spaces.
Yeah.
And still, even at the church that I've been attending sporadically for the last few months, I'm still having at times very emotional experiences. Not every single Sunday. That would probably get exhausting. But but at some moments, something that I'll call grace, or something that I'll call divine love, washes over me and provides spiritual healing and nourishment. And I think in our current moment, politically and socially, where fascism has come to America in a spray-tanned orange, adulterous, misogynistic package, and I don't want to be prescriptive for all people, but I think that people need spaces where they can go for spiritual nourishment. Doesn't have to be a Christian church, doesn't have to be a church. It could be sitting around in the woods, but I think that people need to find some place to ground themselves spiritually. Even our agnostic and atheist friends could find some way to connect to something greater than themselves right now, for strength and motivation to move forward, because this is an incredibly dangerous time to be in America, and it's a dangerous time for the world because of the destabilization. So anybody, I'm very upfront about the fact that I have post-traumatic stress disorder. Didn't help that a cemetery plot salesman told me I was going to burn in hell forever at 9 years old. That contributed to it. So for people who have PTSD, anxiety, depression, right now is a really difficult time, particularly if they're people of color, immigrants, or in some way in the disability community. So we need to find community, and some of that has, I think, spiritual community is a really important piece of that, at least for me.
Yeah. I've got a thought that keeps coming to my brain, so I'm just going to say it. I think you're a mystic. I think you're a mystic.
I bet, yeah.
Like, you're describing mystical experiences. Like they're happening to you, even though your brain is like, what the hell is this? Like, they're happening anyways. That's a mystic when, like, you're just describing mystical experiences. Like, what do you think of that?
Oh, absolutely. I have tattoos that are reflective of mystical experiences that I've had outside of Christian context. One of our professors, who is a brilliant guy, he's now a seminary president in Indiana, but he said one day in class, "There are no mystics in this room," and in my head I was like, bullshit. Let me show you my tattoos and explain to you what they mean. But I didn't, because it would have involved me saying, I ate some mushrooms and here's what happened to me. And now it continues to happen to me at times, despite the fact that I don't eat the mushrooms very often anymore. And so, you don't get to determine what my lived experience with mysticism is. and it doesn't have to look like a Catholic a Catholic in the 4th century out in the desert as a hermit. That might be your frame of reference for mysticism, but it's not mine. And saying that kind of thing in a fundamentalist context, I ate some mushrooms.
You in trouble.
You're in trouble. But I just look at it as, if God didn't want that to happen, then why did God make the psilocybin open that door for me?
Mm-hmm. What's really interesting, I've studied, like, I'm a student of meditation, specific Zen form of meditation, and like, I've studied the neurology and biology of it, because I was told as a kid, like, all of that stuff is the devil. It's all the devil.
Yeah.
Emotions are the devil, and subjective experience is the devil. You have to have objective experience, and we're going to hand that to you so you know what it is, and then you can't question it. Like, that's my...
Right.
So in order for me to, like, actually, like, meditate, I had to figure out, like, okay, so it's not, like, evil. I need to know it's not evil. That fundamentalist kid inside of me is scared. Yeah. So I studied the neurology and the biology of what your brain is doing and what your nervous system is doing. And I realized, like, mystical states are really just a form, like, not just, but they're what your brain does and your nervous system does when it just gets in. So it's biological. I was like, it's not, some enemy evil experience trying to get in there and trick me about, what objective truth really is. It's like, no, this is just your biology. And I was just freed up after that moment when I studied, like, totally dove in. And then I learned that they, like, hooked EEG machines up to all of these different religious leaders of different faith traditions, from faith healers to tongue speakers to Zen Buddhist masters to all these different traditions. And they said, just do your thing, whatever that is, like speak in your tongues or pray your prayers or do your meditation. And we're going to scan your brain. I just want a neurological reading of what's happening in your brain. And then they compared all of these, like, faith traditions, their MRI brain results. They were all the same. The brain was doing the same thing if you're a tongue speaker or a Zen Buddhist meditator. And then that was freeing for me too. Like, okay, so there's a human element to it. It's not the Christians own this part of spirituality against everything else. I'm like, there's a very biological, human thing to spirituality that opens it up for everybody. It's not just the Christians have the corner on the market kind of a thing. That really helped me, because I'm a nerd and I need information like that. Like, it's not, it's like, okay, so this is okay. This is just part of being human. Humans have experienced weird psychedelic trips, whether from mushrooms or from ayahuascas or from just deeply meditating for long periods of time. You get the same result. And you don't have to then put the Christian t-shirt on it to make it okay. Like, it can just be a human thing. And fundamentalists really don't like that part of me, but there it is.
Yeah. I mean, I experienced glossolalia early in my time in the Marine Corps, and it was because my parents at the time were going to a charismatic church, and, I had been steeped in the Southern Baptist and Church of Christ traditions where that's not a thing. You don't speak in tongues in those traditions.
You rebel.
Yeah, and I asked them one day while I was on leave, I was like, hey, what's this baptism of the Holy Spirit thing? And then we went in the living room, and their pastor put his hands on me, and my mom and my stepdad put their hands on me, and the next thing you know, I was in full-on speaking in tongues mode, no idea what on earth was happening, and everybody was just super ecstatic because I'd been baptized in the Holy Spirit. And then it just stopped happening. And I don't know why. And again, just like the hands-on healing thing, I don't know what happened there cognitively as an intellectual person. I just know that that's what I experienced. And then it always felt like I was trying to force it to happen and couldn't make it happen very much anymore. And then I stopped worshiping in those kinds of spaces. And so that, it just kind of dried up. But we don't have the market cornered as Christians or post-Christians on what spirituality is or what God is or what morality is. And that kind of thinking is what it sounds like you and I both went through as adolescence in fundamentalist spaces. And that just doesn't make any sense to me at all anymore. A lot of my work, if you could call it that, is pushing back on fundamentalism and the kinds of things that they spout, particularly now that Christian nationalism is so prevalent in the United States and in our politics, and in shockingly in geopolitics. The first time I heard something like this was in 2002, where I went back to Hawaii and we met the pastor of the church that my ex-wife had been on staff at in the early 90s when I was stationed in Hawaii. And he said that he had just gotten back from the Middle East. He couldn't tell us anything about it except, that it was top secret, that he had went over there with military and political leaders to the Middle East because they were trying to make the rapture happen. It scared the bejesus out of me.
Wow.
Because I was standing there going, oh my God, this is my worst nightmare. The rapture's going to happen and I'm going to be left behind because I'm a worm. I'm a terrible, terrible sinner. And, I can't live up to this Southern Baptist view of what a godly, righteous man is. And now, 20 plus years later, we've got Christian nationalists in the upper echelons of government and making decisions based on, defense and what people can say and think in this country that ostensibly has the wall of separation between church and state. So I push back on a lot of that stuff because it not only doesn't make sense, but it's so antithetical to the teachings of Jesus that it looks nothing like Jesus in my mind.
Yeah. Well, I would like to talk a little bit. We got a little bit of time left. There's a lot of Christians who have wandered out of fundamentalist religious spaces, and they acknowledge that as harmful aberration of the faith and abusive system. They're like, no, that is not what the faith is about. And yet they have not rejected that form of fundamentalist domination, controlling in their politics. They haven't bridged the gap between what they renounced in their faith and now its expression in the political form. How can we help folks tear down the partition between that faith and political, and showing them, good, you rejected it here, but we also need to reject this fundamentalism in its political form that we see it in Christian nationalism today? Have you found any tools to help us tear that down?
Well, I understand that not everybody works this way. That new information may not help people to unravel some of their preconceived beliefs. But it did work that way for me, so I know that it can happen. I studied history academically. That gives you a certain skill set, and also the ability, and one of those is the ability to think critically about information that you're getting. And because I studied history academically, I continue to read the work of knowledgeable, credible historians about things like the founding era, what we call the founding era, and how they wanted to ensure that the United States would not evolve into the sectarian warfare and strife that Christianity caused in Europe because of the marriage of Christianity and power. So there's that. Studying history is important. But if you don't need to be a Christian at all to think that the golden rule is where it's at. Because again, it's a spiritual pattern that's found everywhere from Confucianism to Satanism and all of the faiths in between. And sometimes when I say that Satanists have the golden rule, people look at me like I'm crazy because they think that Satan is worshiping a corporeal demon who wants to dominate the world and turn it into an evil, vile place. And that's not what they are doing. And if you think to yourself, okay, I'm a man, I want bodily autonomy for myself. All right, well, run that through the rubric of the golden rule. Then that means that woman over there deserves that same bodily autonomy that I'm demanding for myself. So autonomy over their reproductive health, autonomy over their whether or not they want to engage in relationships of any kind with men, which is very contrary to something like the kind of theological horseshit that Joel Webbin or Doug Wilson would spout, that women are property, they shouldn't have rights, they shouldn't be in the public sphere at all. I just recently heard Joel Webbin say that women shouldn't have jobs, period. They shouldn't vote and that kind of thing. And then if you say something like that, then you don't take Jesus seriously, because he's the one who said, for Christians, in everything you do, and the in everything part is vitally important, because in our context, that means that if you're going to vote, then you can't vote to take away the rights of somebody that you demand for yourself. You can't love your neighbor by telling your gay, trans, lesbian, intersex, asexual neighbor that they have to fit into this box just because you believe in gender essentialism, which is absolute nonsense. Sugar and spice and everything nice and snakes and snails and puppy dog tails is not the way humanity works, despite those little jingles or limericks that we learned as children. And I don't know if that makes sense for everybody. I know that people like the Joel Webbins of the world, or the Mark Driscolls of the world, are not going to hear Dillon, Naber, Cruz say something like that and have an aha moment, necessarily. They're going to need a road to Damascus moment. And I don't know if I'm the guy to provide that, but for a lot of people, they're out there searching and they're wondering, what does this look like in our political or social context? And a lot of my writing deals with that. And I hope that anybody who stumbles across something that I've written sees that what I'm pushing for is love of neighbor, and what I'd like to get to, and I struggle with this mightily, is love of enemy. Mm-hmm. I have a very hard time. I'm upfront about this a lot. I have a hard time feeling compassion towards those who are actively trying to inflict harm on others. Now, if I saw a car crash and I knew 100% that Pete Hegseth was behind the wheel, I'm still going over there to help him, even though I think he's a vile human being who's a white supremacist and, theocratic, violent theocratic nationalist. Still a human being. So in that moment, I'm going to do what I can to help. I think, right? Mm-hmm. Like, that's what I want to believe about myself. Mm. But I do struggle to have compassion or any kind of love for Russell Vogt, who, for listeners who may not know, he's in charge of the Office of Management and Budget. And he wrote one of the chapters of Project 2025. And he said in his work with the American Enterprise Institute, Center for Renewing America. Sorry, those conservative think tanks start to run in my head, but that Christian nationalism should be a major part of Trump 2.0. And the former Marine in me wants to throat punch that guy, to locate, close with, and destroy my enemy, because that's what I was taught in the Marine Corps, and he's very clearly an enemy. But the person who loves Jesus doesn't want to think that way. And I pray that someday, somehow, I can find it in myself to have Christ-like love for everybody. And that's a tough road to hoe. It just really is. Because there are days, man, when I'm sitting here thinking, I wish somebody would just take these clowns out. And I want so very much to surrender to the myth of redemptive violence. And I know spiritually and intellectually that won't change anything. It would remove a symptom, but it wouldn't be systemically changing.
Yeah, and so much of Jesus' teaching is that very thing. You can't just swap out oppressors and think that life is going to be better.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we have some dark days ahead of us. We're in the disabled community. We are raising our adult disabled child. He's 21 now, and so we watch things very closely. It's like, how will this affect us? Because we are on the margins over there with him, and we got some dark days ahead. We've got some uncertainty ahead. What is giving you hope in these dark times right now?
Something that's giving me hope is that there does seem to be not a national epiphany, but there are people having their epiphanies right now, and they're waking up to the fact that some of the things that people like Dillon have been saying are absolutely true, and I need to reevaluate how I vote, or what the thought process behind why they voted for Donald Trump. And I want to invite those who have come to regret their choice. I want to invite grace for them to say, okay, you know better now, do better. Because there was a time when Dillon did not know better. And Dillon evinced all of the toxic nonsense that fundamentalism brings, right? Because that's the world that I grew up in. That's the pond I was swimming in. And you can't swim in that pond without taking it in, right? So with grace, to come and say, join the resistance. Start to unpack what led you to vote for that person to begin with, and see where the threads take you to some of these other beliefs, and hopefully they can come to a more holistically grounded, more love of neighbor kind of place, where they set aside xenophobia and nationalism or white supremacy or other forms of bigotry, particularly towards the LGBTQ plus community or the disability community or any other person that there are people intentionally marginalizing. And that's what I hope happens. Quite frankly, we need a miracle. And it's not just because of America. Again, this is global. Right, wrong, or indifferent, for the last 75 years or more, the United States has been a global superpower. And that has created some semblance of balance that has mitigated certain instances of violence. Now, I'm not discounting the neo-colonial warmongering of the world's largest, most expensive military. But the apple cart is being upset internationally because of what's happening now. And I hope that people can see that people beyond our borders are worthy of love just like the people here in the United States.
Amen to that. Well, Dillon, I want to thank you for coming on the show. I didn't get to any of my questions because the conversation was just good.
And I loved this conversation. Where would you like to send people to connect with your work? What's the best place to find you?
Yeah, you can go to The Tattooed Theologian. That's my blog. The God Squad pod is every Thursday night live streamed. And then you can find it wherever you find your podcast. And I'm also all over social media, very active in doing the work of public theology.
Awesome. Well, I will put those links down in the notes so people can just click on them and find you.
Okay, I can send those to you if you need them.
Cool. That'd be cool. Well, Dillon, thanks for coming on the show. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Absolutely. Anytime, Tom.